This presentation is available for MCLE self-study credit. If you would like to receive credit, you must take 3 actions. First, click the Show More text below on our YouTube page. The text will expand and show a link to download the handout materials. Once you finish watching this presentation, please click the quiz link to receive self-study credit. Once the quiz is successfully completed, you will receive a certificate via email within 72 hours. We hope you enjoy the presentation.
All right, so now please allow me to introduce to you our next speakers, the Honorable Steve Austin and the Honorable Winifred Smith, who will speak on elimination of bias. First, we have the Honorable Stephen Austin, who joined us in joined ADR services into 2022 after a distinguished 23 years of judicial service as a judge of the Superior Court for the County of Contra Costa. For 13 years, Judge Austin managed a busy civil direct assignment caseload where he was responsible for all case management, law in motion, discovery, settlement conferences, and trials. He became widely renowned for proactively and successfully settling his cases, conducting close to 1,000 settlement conferences over the course of his judicial career. In addition, Judge Austin was deeply involved in court leadership and worked tirelessly to promote better access to the court system for the underserved. As a neutral mediator, arbitrator, and referee, Judge Austin's approachable personality and fierce intellect allow him to appreciate the complexities and subtleties of each case before him and views everyone as a person rather than a problem, adding a humanizing element to each matter he handles.
I didn't write that, Howard.
Next, the Honorable Winifred Smith comes to ADR services with 21 years of experience as a judge of the Alameda County Superior Court and 26 years as Deputy Attorney General in the California Attorney General's Office. Judge Smith has extensive experience in a variety of civil cases, including coordinated cases, class actions, employment, construction defect, and Proposition 65 matters, and has presided over many cases presenting questions of first impression. In her 13 years serving in civil assignments, Judge Smith presided over nearly 100 cases to verdict, including a product liability complex litigation case, which resulted in the largest civil award in California's history. She has been affirmed in 95% of her cases on appeal. Now with ADR Services, Inc. as a full-time neutral, Judge Smith is widely respected for her judicial demeanor and ability to deftly manage complex matters to resolution. Judge Austin and Judge Smith, take it away.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I welcome you to our course on the elimination of bias. And I'm hoping that after the hour, we will be armed with a few more strategies and things to think about in terms of how one addresses bias, both in terms of how it is presented to you as someone against whom is being biased, and also making you more self-aware that you may be practicing some biases that you don't know about, but you can certainly do something about. So I think that before you talk about the elimination of bias or strategies for eliminating bias, we need to talk about exactly what bias is. So if we could go to slide number 3. So what is bias? Well, bias is something that nobody wants to admit having, but is something that everybody has. I know that in talking to juries or prospective jurors, I always would say to them, we all have biases. We all bring our personal experiences to the experience. And you don't want to say you don't have biases. You just want to know what they are and not allow them to be fair and impartial. So I think that we all need to first acknowledge that we all have biases. And so in knowing that you have a bias, I think it makes you better prepared to be aware of it and to guard against showing bias to other people or allowing it to happen in your presence. Next slide. So there are 2 kinds of biases. Generally, definition is a bias is a prejudice against or in favor of a person or thing or group compared to something else. And it's really referred to as stereotyping, sort of seeing something and maybe not seeing exactly what's in front of you, but what you're expecting to see, sort of reading your own experience into what's happening around you and what you're experiencing. And bias actually stems from the human tendency to categorize things and people that they encounter. So if you see someone that has particular characteristics, then you lump them together with others who may have those particular characteristics without actually seeing the individual. And what may happen is that either favorably or not favorably, you may treat them in a particular way by categorizing them in a particular way. So being aware of what bias actually is and that you have them will hopefully arm you with the ability to develop strategies around bias. So next step. Next slide. So there are really two types of bias, conscious or explicit biases. And those are biases that we are aware of. They're not always all bad, but they are things that we consciously sort of weave into our life. We know what we like, what we don't like, and we respond to that. So you may be aware that you have a bias against just something silly, sitting in the sun. So you always stay out of the sun because you know you have a bias against being in the sun. You may know that you have a bias towards a particular type of experience, going to a particular sporting event, or going to a particular event that you enjoy. So if you have a bias in favor of doing particular things, then you do those things. You also may have biases against certain things, and so you may avoid those things because you know, I don't like that. Maybe without actually thinking about an individual experience, but just in general, I don't like that and I'm not going to do it. Alternatively, there's unconscious or implicit bias, and those are biases that exist outside our awareness. And sometimes those are biases that are kind of the most insidious because you aren't aware of them, but you act on them. And so by doing that, you can cause hurt to other people because you're not really aware that you've incorporated your behavior or your thoughts or your experiences in a way that can be detrimental. And so I think in terms of talking about implicit and explicit bias, you want to know that if you're embracing a bias, what effect does that have on other people? What effect does that have on you professionally and the way you deal with your peers, the way you deal with your superiors, or maybe people that you are supervising? So just knowing what bias is, knowing that we have them, and knowing there are types of bias, you can kind of examine your own behavior as you go forward. And we'll talk today a little bit about in the professional world.
I really think that what's gone on with unconscious bias and the studies and discoveries about that over the last 20 years have really opened a lot of avenues for, I know, teaching these kind of classes. And both of us taught as judges in the early days before this was really accepted. And it was very difficult. People feel like you're saying they're a bad person if they have biases, that this is something that's their fault. And really, most of these biases are unconscious. Many of them are. And you don't even know you have them. Really, they're buried somewhere deep back in your brain. And but there are techniques to address that once you recognize what those may be that are going on. That takes kind of the personal blame out of it. And I think that that's important. And it makes people more accepting to change.
And I agree with you. And I'll just to give myself as an example. When I joined the bench in Alameda, I heard all kinds of cases and saw all kinds of people. And what I realized is that I had a bias in favor of older people. And when I would listen to them, people either explain things to me or testify, I tended to believe them. Is that, how could that little old lady not be telling me the truth? And once I realized that I had a bias in favor of old people, then I began to sort of adjust my behavior, because while in and of itself, sort of thinking old people are great is not a bad thing. But if you are evaluating the credibility of someone or two people or three people, and you're sort of deciding among them, how are you perceiving their behavior or what they're saying? And in the back of your mind, you're inclined to believe the little old lady just because she's a little old lady, then you realize, what? That's not always a good thing. So
hard not to believe the little old ladies, though. So it is, but at the same time, I agree with you on that. There were all kind of things popped up when I took the bench. And you really have to sit and examine everything about it when you're making decisions, whether or not you're being affected by your unconscious biases. That when you're making that decision, if you put this person in, if it wasn't a little old lady saying the same thing and it was somebody else, would I be ruling it the same way? And it's
Exactly.
yeah, it's a hard process to go through, but it's really important to always be aware.
Yeah, and I think just knowing you need to be self-aware and self-examining, examining your behavior and being conscious of doing that is a good step or a good first step in addressing that.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
Yeah.
Okay, we do the next slide. So unconscious biases. This is a list of some of them. There are many others that are deeply embedded into our brain someplace. The studies show that they actually get in there sometime during your childhood. There's a lot of interesting studies on how we develop unconscious biases. And so yeah, at the time when we're children, and they get put away in there somehow, and then they come out through the rest of your life, and you don't even realize what's going on, that you have this unconscious bias. And it could be to any of these categories, some of the other categories, gender identity or expression, disability is a big one, religion, sexual orientation. There's just countless others that could have biases that are unconscious, things that you don't even know. The studies show also that oftentimes the unconscious biases that everybody has are inconsistent with their conscious values. So a person consciously believes that in certain things, that this is the right way to be, and this is the how to act, and the moral way to act, and the proper way to act. But inside, things are going on in the unconscious level that we're just not aware of, that may not be consistent with those values. I think it's important too, the science is saying that there's lots of ways to address them. So that's a good thing. So
let me throw a couple out there that, I think are sort of contemporary issues that we're dealing with. There are biases perhaps particularly in the workplace, where if people have children, they're perceived a little differently. This is in addition to the list we have on the screen, that a person who has a child at home may not be able to be as efficient as the person that is childless, and that you may want that person on your team versus the person who has a child, and the person who has a child may be no less efficient than anyone else, but you just perceive that person, or you may rob them of an opportunity to participate in something that they are otherwise completely qualified to do. Accents, if someone has an accent you're unfamiliar with, and you may think that may interfere with your ability to either do business or somebody to understand. Complicated names, and also appearance. When we talk about physical characteristics, height, weight, and grooming, but think about tattoos, piercings, hair, locks, shaved head. If someone's uncomfortable, they may not even realize it. Maybe you're uncomfortable if you're walking into a meeting where people don't look like you think they should look to conduct business, whether they're prepared to be in the meeting or not. You may favor having someone participate in something because you're concerned about the appearance of whatever you're involved in. So being aware that there are all these ways, it's not one size fits all bias. There are a few categories that probably get more attention than others. But I think being aware that there are infinite numbers of biases that anyone can have, because we all have our experiences. So we all have very different kinds of biases. So they're not just the 1, 2, or 3 things. Race, gender, ethnicity, those are things we talk about a lot. Yeah. But if you are a person who is a little different than someone else perceives, and those differences are very personal, they could come into play in some very negative ways, maybe positive for some people, but negative for others. If beauty bias is something that's talked about a lot. So just throwing out there that just keep in mind that there are not a finite number of biases, but an infinite number of biases. And
there really
so,
are. It's when you start thinking about it, how many different things that you personally may have a preference one way or the other, and not even realize that you have the preference. And it's important to make sure that whenever you're taking action or dealing with people, that you keep those in mind. That, wait a second, is this one of those things that's being triggered right now that I don't even know I have in my head, as why I'm reacting that way.
exactly.
There's a lot of introspection that goes along with it.
And the willingness to be introspective.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about some of the studies, and they have the terms really of different kinds of bias. So starting with the next slide. Affinity bias. That's where you're biased towards somebody because of something that they have that is similar to you. It could be almost anything. They come from the same town, went to the same college, like to cook the same thing. It's almost endless. They look like you, anything like that, like the same sports teams. There's tons of things that could constitute trigger affinity bias. And affinity bias can be sometimes a good thing to a certain degree. I know when I'm in mediations, I oftentimes, when I'm talking to the parties or talking to the parties themselves and the attorneys, when you find something that you have in common, it helps to feel closer and more trusting between the people. I've noticed that. I know I do when I'm talking to attorneys and parties, that sometimes I feel that way, and I think they do the same way with me. Like if you figure out you're from the same town or something like that, if in an interpersonal setting, sometimes that can be a good thing. Where it's bad is when the affinity ends up putting people ahead of other people because you have an affinity towards them, and so it can't work out. That the bias, the positive bias towards others, can turn into a negative bias to other groups that aren't part of that affinity. Conformity bias. That's the bias that you just go along with everybody else. That's pretty much what that means. We have an inherent social nature in us as people, and it's very difficult to break the social bonds in certain times when people are behaving in a certain way that are in your group to stand out and do something else. And it comes up all the time on hiring committees. I know I did a lot of those when I was PJ and APJ at our court. I was always on those. And it's very difficult. You're in a room with three people, and if two of them really feel a certain way, it's really hard to be the one that says, well, I don't agree with that. It's a lot easier in terms of, I think, you're just the natural way that we behave to conform to the group. And if it's important to recognize that when you're in those kind of group settings. Confirmation bias. That's the unconscious way we highlight or believe information that supports our preconceived beliefs or biases. There's a great example of that came up in a study not too long ago, where 60 different partners and firms were contacted and signed up to be participants in the study. They were each given a legal memo that was identical, but half of them had the memo coming from a guy named Tom Myers, who was at NYU and was Caucasian, and the other one was from Tom Myers, who was at NYU and was African American. The memos had purposeful errors in them. They had a whole bunch of different errors that when they got drawn up, they showed that they had those errors on purpose, but they didn't tell any of the test participants that. And the 60 partners were then sent these and asked to grade them on how good they are, see if they could point out where the errors were in it, and then send them back in. What ended up happening was there was a great deal more errors found by the graders for the African American Tom Myers than there was for the Caucasian Tom Myers. And the authors of the study believed that was, and I think it's true, it's confirmation bias, that somewhere deep in their heads, the 60 partners had in there, Caucasian people write better than African American people. And without consciously thinking that, that's what ended up happening with the study. It can be very damaging in so many different ways. In hiring, it can be damaging in lawsuits. If you get confirmation bias, you could just get carried away with certain things that are involved in the lawsuit, and that confirm to your preconceived notice and ideas, and then you ignore the rest. And in just dealing with people generally. That's a potentially very, very serious area of bias.
One of the ways in which all three of these categories of bias are being addressed is sort of blind hiring, blind grading, blind assessments, because for the very reasons that you just explained about the study that was done, and the confirmation bias is one that often people, bring from childhood, those things that have been reaffirmed over and over and over again in their experience. And, just to throw out there that I know that I read an article where the symphonies were actually having prospective musicians perform behind a screen, so that those people who were determining who was going to get hired couldn't see them. They could only hear them. Because really, of course, what's important is whether or how you sound with your instrument. Can you sing? Can you play the violin? And not what you look like, but the overwhelming number of people in an orchestra are generally white and male, and so women were not getting opportunities, and people of color were not getting opportunities to join certain institutions. So that what they decided to do, and what has been done more frequently, is sort of blindly determining merit. And so that's just one way it's being addressed, but I think also in addition to being addressed in that way, because in some ways it lets people off the hook for their biases, is to address, in addition to that, addressing it directly and saying, am I really being fair here? And second guessing yourself if you need to, if you're in a situation where you're dealing with something that you're unfamiliar with, and maybe second guessing your own reactions. Is this fair? How am I behaving in this situation? So
just taking a moment, if you just take that moment before you act or make a decision to do that quick analysis, it doesn't have to take very long. And I've had it happen with me where it all of a sudden pops up and I go, I think maybe I am. Let me go back and look at this again, just by doing the little quick assessment. Exactly. Okay, why don't you go to the next slide? Nonverbal or labeling bias. That's like you're watching something, you're looking at someone, and then it's how their appearance, something about the way that they behave physically, that can really affect the way that your unconscious biases are triggered. So it would be way they dress, those type of things, and body movements. I know on the bench, one that I had. I really have to watch myself, was eye rolling. I don't know where the eye rolling came. Now I know that really bothers me. So it's way back in there somewhere. I think my mom used to roll her eyes at me sometimes. I don't know what it is. When I was a little kid, something did it. So when it happens, if I don't take a moment to, now that I'm aware that it's in there someplace, if I don't take a moment to reflect before I react really quickly when I'm on the bench with someone rolling their eyes at me after I talk. And a lot of times people don't even know they're doing it, So and it's not about you. But there's something about it that I unconsciously react to, and all of us have things like that we react to unconsciously, or biases that we have against people by the way they look or act. That are something that we really don't have much control over unless we take control. Halo and horn, we've been talking about that. Those are really old concepts. Before they got into unconscious bias, they were talking about the halo and horn effect. And basically what that is somebody's good at something, and so you think they're good at everything, and you ignore the way that they behave in other aspects, so that you have an affinity towards that person. You have that person is somebody that you think is going to be good, and they end up being promoted in jobs when maybe they don't have the skills to do that. Horn is the opposite. So horn would be you have an immediate negative impression of somebody. Or maybe there's just one thing that they do that you believe is not good, and that affects everything about that person to you. And we have a natural tendency to do that as people, and it's important to make sure that we're aware of that and take charge individually.
You know, I also think that you assign certain characteristics to groups of people based on your experience over time.
Yeah.
Or even just sort of culturally what goes on around you, so that in terms of the halo effect, you know, if someone in a group or there's a characteristic of a group, then everyone in that group, you're going to sort of assume they have that same characteristic, and maybe in a positive way or in a negative way. You know, that if you have had an experience over time, or just it could be a one-time experience, or just a series of experiences with people in a particular group, maybe you're not even understanding what that thing they're doing means. But if you decide that in your view, in your value system, it's somewhat negative, then every time you run into someone who is a member of that group, then you're going to assume that that they have that negative characteristic, or they're incapable or whatever, and then you're just not going to give them an opportunity to prove otherwise.
It's easy for that to happen.
I think it does frequently.
Yeah.
So why don't we go to the next slide? So I think it's so now, having sort of talked about the sort of universe of types of biases that you want to think about as you go through life, it's like, how can you because we all have biases ourselves, starting with our own biases. How can you overcome your own biases? Well, I think you can start by identifying situations in which implicit bias may be impacting your behavior. And I think that's hard, first of all, because implicit bias is, by its very nature, something that's sort of subconscious, and it may be something that is deeply rooted in your life. That is, that you have had experiences over time, or you may have had a traumatic experience in your life. Whatever it is sort of embedded in what you do, so that you're not thinking about it. So the willingness to really examine yourself, your behavior, and how you respond to things is really important. So when you're in a situation where you may need to make decisions that affect other people, you really want to think, is there anything about this that is calling up bias that I may have that may affect my decision making? Focusing on people as individuals rather than on stereotypes. Some people find that hard to do, but I think that if you force yourself to look at an individual and the situation in which you are with that individual, you may respond very differently than if you make certain assumptions. And I think the ability to do that just overcomes a certain maybe a natural laziness that we have, just to sort of respond to the way we usually do to things. I know as a judge, I found that I had to be hyper aware, because the decisions that I made really impacted people's lives deeply and perhaps forever. So if I'm sitting there, I'm talking to somebody, I can't let I always told myself, I can't let the things that ordinarily might affect my decision making to just automatically affect it, but do I need to do something different? Do I need to look at this through a different lens? Do I need to evaluate this through thinking about the problem very differently, or the situation very differently?
I know that for me anyway, and I think studies have proven as well, the busier I am, the more likely stereotypes pop in, because you just don't have time. And so you end up maybe making assumptions about people based on some unconscious bias that you may have, because you don't have time to be sitting back and doing it otherwise. We're kind of wired like that, but it's important that you make time to not have that happen.
And one of the things that we'll talk about in a few slides is also the power dynamic in the situation, where this may, as a judge, people may not be comfortable calling you on something that they feel you're exhibiting biased behavior. So you really do, the responsibility is yours or ours,
Yeah.
people who are in in a position of power to control that and deal with it, because others may not feel comfortable or capable of doing that. Finally, to adjust your perspective, how would you respond if you were in the same position? I think that's always a really good way to check in. If I'm standing here having to tell somebody this story and asking them to make a decision or an evaluation of what's going on, how would I feel if I'm sitting there and I'm telling this story and somebody has to do that? What would I do? So putting yourself in someone else's shoes or walking in their shoes, I think that's a very good way to sort of check your own behavior and decide, maybe I need to change the way I approach this or the way I do it going forward.
Yeah, I think also the role playing too, I've done in my head, where you just switch. If you have somebody and you think, well, am I being biased in my thought process because the person's gender, say, then I'll switch the genders in my head. And so I'll pretend in my head, well, what if, okay, let's assume I'm looking at this person and they're the other gender, would I do the same thing? And you could do that in all different kinds of potential biased areas.
True. So next slide. So I think some practical things that you can do is to make an effort to interact with people you perceive as different. If you are not accustomed to, or in your daily life, you don't come in contact with groups of people, particularly if you're in a situation where you're going to have to make decisions about them, reach out, try to have different experiences, try to be more culturally competent about people that are different than you, and to learn about them, learn about their customs, holidays, diet, food choices, those kinds of things that may actually educate you and expand your own life. So becoming more culturally competent about groups that you don't interact with frequently can actually have a positive effect and expand your own worldview. And also be cognizant of positive stereotypes in your response to them. That's sort of more the halo of looking at people and saying, oh, you're competent just because you have these particular characteristics. Or education bias is a good one, where if you went to this school, you must be great, you must be prepared, you must be qualified. Where somebody who didn't go to a school you even know about, or is not considered as good as another school, well, you necessarily may not be as smart, or maybe you don't put them in a pool of potential candidates for something. You may not even talk to somebody who went to a particular institution that you personally don't respect, because for whatever your reasons are. So being cognizant of positive stereotypes and positive biases is as important as being aware of negative ones and their impact on what you do and how you do it. Let's see, next slide, please. So some tips for responding to biased behavior when it happens to you. Don't let the incident or comment pass. Often it is in conversation. Someone will say something that is you feel is inappropriate and is showing bias to you. So addressing it in the moment may give the person who is exhibiting the bias behavior pause the next time, that they may not behave in that way. It also may give you an opportunity to determine whether or not they were in fact behaving in a biased way, or they meant it in a particular way that you perceived it. So addressing it in the moment, I think, assists both the person who is feeling that behavior exhibited toward them, as well as the person who is perpetrating that behavior, for lack of a better word, because I think you can educate, or at least make them aware that this is happening, so they will not do it again. It may be a moment, a teachable moment, maybe not, because not everybody has the responsibility to educate people who exhibit biased behavior, but it may, depending on the situation, if you work with that person, or you may come in contact with that person frequently, or they may be a friend, it may be an opportunity to kind of clear the air. So don't let behavior pass. Don't wait until some other time to address it. Address it in the moment. It may be hard. because in the moment you may be shocked, you may be angry, there may be a lot of things that you're feeling at that moment. But I think that it's important to not let it go. You want to give yourself a moment to move beyond whatever anger or disrespect you may be feeling before you engage. And so before you give yourself a second and think about how you want to approach it, what words you want to use, because they have meaning as well. And you may not be effective in communicating how you're feeling if you are using language or you are expressing anger. The person may not be able to accept that or read that. So if you're going to engage,
when that happens, all the person hears is the anger and doesn't hear the substance. That's what I think anyway, and they feel under attack, and that should be avoided if at all possible. And to approach it as kind of not necessarily a teaching moment, but just to make sure the person's aware that what just happened is not right.
Yeah, and you may want to think as you're deciding how you want to approach it. How do you want the conversation to end? What do you want the outcome to be?
Mm-hmm.
It could be different things, and so you want to shape your conversation with that person, keeping in mind what the goal of the conversation, how you want it to end, what you want to walk away with, and how you want that person to walk away from the situation, thinking about or feeling. And I would agree with you that tit for tat doesn't help, and being angry doesn't help. You might want to just sort of think of it as being the adult in the room and just say, okay, I'm going to take control of this situation in a rational way. I'm going to have this conversation and say it in neutral enough language so that the person hears what you're saying. Not neutral to the point of not expressing yourself, but just not using invective or accusatory tones, so that it's like, okay, this is what it is. It may be hard. I mean, it's not easy. I don't want to suggest that it is, but I do think it's necessary when you engage in that kind of dialogue. Next slide. You're on, Steve.
Oh, so what you need to do when in those settings, in that situation, you should calmly describe what your concerns are to the offender or the person. I like to do it in terms of I language. I think you're not taking me seriously when you call me honey, something like that, where you're talking from your own point of view, not necessarily how you feel, but you're not doing it in a way you shouldn't be doing that. You're doing it in a way of pointing out what the problem is and then leaving it more for the person then to react. So you're describing what the problem is, but in a non kind of threatening or attacking way. And these things are all fraught with potential problems, and they'd be taken by the person who was exhibiting the biased behavior wrongly. That could always happen, but you can avoid it, I think, much more often if you say it in a way that's not really forcefully accusing. Now, to facilitate, if you can't do it right there, maybe you can go talk. So, hey, can I talk to you for a second? And then go somewhere else so the other people aren't around. I think that's a good idea. I don't know about you anyway. You think to do it right away is one thing, but also quickly, if you could figure out a way so it's not in front of other people at the same time. Do you think that's
it might
a
be,
good
but
thing?
if someone has said something that's embarrassed you in front of other people, it might not be a bad idea to speak in the moment, because you may not want other people to feel it's okay to say those kinds of things to you or about you. So it is a judgment call. It depends on what kind of conversation you want to have. You may want to say something and then sort of put a pin in it for the moment and then have a longer, more in-depth conversation with the person later. But I think that it sometimes is necessary, particularly if you're in a group setting and someone says something a little bit more blatant, then you might want to say that, I don't appreciate that, that was hurtful. And then you may want to, for this reason, then you may want to have a conversation in more depth later and say, this is really what's going on. And then you may, explain.
I think that's important
Yeah.
to do it that way when you have other people there, because your feelings are important too, and so it's important that other people know that you think that's wrong, and that and you stood up for yourself in that setting, and that it's okay for them. It's empowering for other people to do the same thing. That this is okay to speak up when there's bias, and to say something, and it could help other people do the same thing later on. So using this as a dialogue process or an educational process, I think that it always happens whenever you start talking about something like that. As long as the person's approached with the right kind of attitude, I think most people, again, we're dealing with unconscious biases here. A lot of times people don't even know what they just did was wrong. That you could really educate and be helpful. I know when there's times where I've done that, and people have approached me, and I said, "Well, thanks. I didn't realize that. I'm glad you told me." And I think that's almost a natural reaction with most people when they're not realizing what they're doing is being perceived as bias.
Well, yeah, and going back to the situation, and we'll talk about it in a slide or two, is the dynamic. So if you're in a group with your superior and a group of other people, you may want to think twice about what you want to say in the presence of your peers, and the person who is your superior has said something that to which you took offense.
Yeah.
But maybe if it's a peer-to-peer situation, you would feel a little different. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I think it's fair to say it all depends. It all depends. And then, it may lead to a longer conversation, a series of conversations, and depending on what the setting is, it may lead to needing to educate a group of people, realizing that this is what's happening, say, in your workplace. So I think it really is situational, but however it is addressed, it just needs to be addressed, I think is the point. Any one or more of the things that are on the screen may come into play. But I think the critical part is to make sure that you don't just walk away from it. Because it doesn't help. It doesn't help you because you have been the object of it. You don't need to walk around with that feeling that you've been disrespected in some way or
there's baggage from being disrespected, and there's also baggage because you think I should have said something, and that can stick with you even longer, and it feels right to say something. I think in that setting.
You don't want to go home and bang on the wall when you should have just spoken.
No. Why did I say something? Yeah, you don't want to do that. Okay, let's go next slide. I'm going to jet through this pretty fast. It's we're shifting over to some ethical requirements that have to do with bias, and I think they're important to always remember when you're out practicing, and it also can help guide in a way of how you should respond, or how you respond to others, or what you can do when other people are behaving in a biased way. Everybody should be familiar by now with Rule 8.4.1. It was it's been about 5 years now. It really is changed things, I think, for the better. It's made a requirement that when you're representing a client, that's the one I'm going to really address. When you're representing the client, that no lawyer can unlawfully harass or unlawfully discriminate against persons that have a protected characteristic, and or unlawfully retaliate against those people. The rule defines the persons that have protected characteristics really broadly. It's a large group. I'm not going to read it. If you get the rule, and we might put it as a handout, or you could just look it up. It tells you all the different areas of potential bias that can come in, and those are protected groups, as well as others that they've left out. They said they have a catch-all at the end. So it's very, very broad. And representing a client means anything having to do with your representation of that client. So anything that happens between you and the client, anything that would happen in terms of your litigation. If you're in litigation, contact with opposing counsel, contact with and by email, telephone, in person, in court, before a judge, in your pleadings, anywhere that unlawful harassment or unlawful discrimination is unwarranted and forbidden. Now, it doesn't really define in the rule what unlawful is, and it's more than just a passing discrimination or harassment. It's usually more of a pattern that could lead to that. I know the EEOC has rules about what's unlawful. There's different kind of ways to look at it, and it hasn't really been fully fleshed out by the bar exactly what is meant by that term. There's a definition, but it's a very broad definition, and it's a little difficult to know exactly what each unlawful behavior would be. There's another provision of it that's really important to note as well, and that's that in law firm operations, lawyers shall not unlawfully discriminate or knowingly permit unlawful discrimination or unlawfully harass or permit the unlawful harassment of an employee or anybody who's affiliated or works for the firm. That last part, unlawfully, knowingly permit, that's been defined in the rule as failing to advocate corrective action, which is kind of a big thing. So that means anybody at the firm, if they see something going on that's a policy or a practice that results in unlawful discrimination or harassment, needs to do something about it. Now, it could be as much as talking to another higher up in the law firm, or that hasn't really been determined. But it's important that everybody realizes that even people that are not the bosses have responsibilities to act in that situation. Okay, we can go to the next one. Judges have responsibilities too. It's not just the attorney. Canon 3B5 says that judges shall perform their duties without bias or prejudice. And that's an important one. So all of us have that ethical duty when we're sitting up on the bench and we think about it. It's one of the ways that judges get in trouble. Probably one of the most next to demeanor is performing your duties and having bias or prejudice that are involved in it. It's important to know that all judges have that same duty. If you're having a problem with a judge and you believe that they have or have behaved with bias, and you're not really wanting to go to that judge directly because sometimes people don't want to do that. The other judges all have the same ethical responsibility. So if you learn that another judge has potentially been biased or prejudiced in their behavior or words, you have to take action. In fact, you have to take corrective action. And so you could go to another judge, one that you may have a relationship with that is better, and tell that judge about it. And that pretty much puts that judge ethically in a position where they have to take some corrective action. And it could be the supervising judge or the presiding judge. All these other judges, when they get knowledge that another judge may have behaved in a biased way, have to take action. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing judges have to do, and that's 3B6, have to require the lawyers in the proceedings before the judge refrain from bias. And that comes up more than it does. I don't know about you, Winnie, but it's happened where I've had to take corrective action with things that I've witnessed in court, witnessed in the hallways, things that I've witnessed or been told about by opposing counsel or one of the lawyers, or even witnesses or jurors, which is amazing. But I had it happen one time with jurors that overheard something out in the hallway. We have a duty to take corrective action when we see that. So if you're a counsel and you're having problems with the other side, it's really important to bring that to the judge's attention. If you're being harassed or subjected to biased behavior. Because once you do, it triggers with the judge that they have a duty, ethical duty to do something about it. Now that could be just talking to the lawyer who was who has had the issue, or it could be higher, could go farther up, end up being potential sanctions in the case, could be report to the state bar, depending on the severity.
Yeah, I did, as a sitting judge, have many occasions to certainly correct behavior while lawyers were in front of me in the courtroom. I rarely had a situation where people were complaining about something that was out of view, but occasionally, and it is important to address, particularly things that are happening in front of you, just because you want to maintain a certain decorum in your courtroom. And so, yes, there is certainly your obligation to do it, but I also think that it's just one of those things where you want to encourage or require that a certain decorum in your courtroom, so that taking corrective action in the moment is really critical. I remember once having a pre-trial conference in my chambers. So this was just three or four lawyers in my chambers, and someone said something that was just really inappropriate to another lawyer, and of a racial nature. And I stopped right then and there, and I said, I'm not having any of this during the course of this trial. So I apologize right now, as we're going to stop. Apologize. And so it's really critical, because judges are certainly setting the standard. And if they don't do it, then it's not going to happen, because other lawyers are certainly not going to police themselves. And then it also sets a tone for your courtroom in general. The word gets around that that's okay. I've contacted senior partners when lawyers who have appeared, I thought, really done things that did not reflect well on their firm. It's like, I know you don't train your lawyers to behave this way, so this is what happened, and you need to know about it. So I've done that, but you sort of do what you have to do to make sure that a certain standard is maintained in your courtroom, and come and demand that of everyone who appears in front of you.
I've seen pleadings when you end up getting why it happens always in discovery. I don't know why, but it does a lot. And so you end up getting, everybody puts their nasty grams on the declaration when they're coming in trying to get sanctions, but they're actually both saying things back and forth. But where there's been real gender bias issues, I've seen that more than one time in the letters that are attached to the emails that are attached to the declarations, as people are, they're getting hotter and hotter in their dispute, and taking immediate action on that. Call the lawyers to make sure that they come in, and then we discuss it in person, to what I've just read in the pleadings. And
depositions where things can get wild. Things can get really wild, and people forget where they are, and you read it and it's like, oh my God, you didn't really say that, did you? It's like, no. So, you just have to address it however it comes to you. It needs to be addressed. I probably need to move on.
Yeah, let's move on. We got to get going. We're
okay.
Running.
So dynamics matter, and I've referred to this a couple of times as we've gone through the previous slides. It really depends upon who's involved in the conversation, kind of what happens and how you address bias. So if you're speaking from authority, and in this, we just discussed this, you have a certain responsibility to manage your behavior, and sometimes in your presence, the behavior of others, to set an example, and also to set a tone as to what's going to happen in either in your firm or your courtroom, or whatever situation that you are in authority. So you have to be careful what you say and how you say it. Sometimes, judges are, have short tempers too, but you really can't afford to display that when you are trying to manage other people in your courtroom. Otherwise, you're giving them permission to do the same thing and to say those things to each other. If you are someone who is an authority, take advantage of opportunities for bias training. Be a lifelong learner. Be open to learning different things. Be open to new ideas and suggestions of ways to modify your behavior to create a more fair dynamic when you are the person in charge. You have to respond to biased comments and behaviors exhibited by others in your presence. We just talked about that, or of which you are aware. Steve and I are judges, so we may see it. For example, you're in you're in litigation, you're in a trial, and you read a transcript, and maybe someone who, if sometimes this is, I hear from younger associates and women associates, where in those situations, they're frankly mistreated outside the view of the judge. They may be mistreated, say, in a deposition where things are said that just shouldn't be said. So when you know this is happening, you have to call the person who's exhibiting this behavior on it and say, "This, I'm not going to tolerate this." So it really is incumbent upon the person in charge to take charge and to be an example. That may sound very simplistic, but it's necessary, and it is effective. Want to talk next slide?
We've already talked pretty much about peer-to-peer. I think we had a good talk about that. Like, what do you do when you see it happen right in front of you? And I thought about that when we were responding to it. Peer-to-peer is a little bit different than when there's a power dynamic difference. But you still have to figure out before you react. It's good to think and about what the outcome is that you want out of this discussion that you're about to have. It's really important to think about what the relationship you already have with the person is. If you guys are close, it's actually easy sometimes to say, "Hey, what was that you just said?" It's a little bit easier to do than if you don't really know the person. But at the same time, even if you don't, as long as you treat it respectfully and you're not accusatory, and it's more just making sure the person's aware that what they just said was inappropriate, I think that works well with peer-to-peer situations.
Yeah,
the one
no,
that's go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking that sometimes when you're speaking with your peers, sometimes familiarity breeds contempt, and so sometimes people may feel they can take license to do and say things they might not otherwise say.
Yeah.
And you have to be careful of that in your own peer interactions. So you may be aware of that, but you also may react differently if you are in a situation where you're speaking with a peer. So just be cognizant of that as you're going through, your interactions with people, in your workplace or socially. I mean, these things can happen in bars, association situations. It doesn't have to necessarily be at work. Nature of past interaction too. You may have had other interactions that may be positive, so that something is an anomaly, or you may have had a series of interactions where the person has done and said the same thing again. So your response may be a little different than if it's a complete anomaly versus something that is just sort of brewing and building on itself.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide real quick. We've got a couple more minutes. Speaking to authority, this is the tough one. So if it is the judge, if it is your boss, if it is somebody who has power over you, what do you do? How do you go about doing it? I think you have to really take an assessment of what the situation is, and think it through before you get going. If you have a possibility of having another partner or another trusted person who's been in the firm for longer than you, or somebody that maybe have the ear of the person who has been biased or performed biasly, that's to get them involved in the process is great. A lot of firms have HR people. HR people are your friend when you're in these situations, and so it's really important to contact them and get them in the process. If you see somebody at your firm higher up than you that has power over you, it's an ally. And with judges, as we said, all judges have the same ethical responsibilities. So lots of judges like it, if you not necessarily like it, but are approachable if they've done something that they're not aware of. But you could always get another judge to help out too.
Absolutely. One last slide. Okay, so if you question whether the conversation in the moment will be effective, then you should have it. You may feel that it's not something, we talked about this a little earlier, so we'll sort of speed through this so we're almost done. You may need to send a memo or a letter rather than a face-to-face conversation. There are many situations in which that is really the most appropriate way to handle it. You may want to use an intermediary or a mentor if that's appropriate. Again, it's situational, but these are things that you can consider. No, there's no one size fits all, and there's no one way to respond to any situation of bias. And I think it is now 1 o'clock, and the last message both Judge Austin and I would want to say is just don't let it slide. Do something. Do something, say something.
You'll feel better, and it'll be better for everybody concerned.
ADR Services, Inc. has been your unwavering partner in alternative dispute resolution. But as the world changed, so did we. From virtual and hybrid hearings to our ongoing on-demand CLE program, ADR Services, Inc. continues to keep resolution and legal education at the forefront, woman-owned and operated from the start. There is someone for every situation. We are ADR Services, Inc.